Hello, welcome back to another episode of Convos in the Office. And who do we have here today?
My name is Michiko Wild. I'm a recent graduate from the CHID program.
Tell me about your last quarter.
So my last quarter was winter 2022, and I graduated in anthropology and the CHID program. So I was mostly just finishing my thesis for the majority of the quarter. I did a 3-quarter thesis, so I took about as long as I could, and I'm still working on it now.
And that's what we're talking about today, your thesis. Would you like to give a little abstract about it?
Yeah, my thesis is a graphic novel combined with like an archive of materials about my grandmother and my relationship to my grandmother, especially like through the lens of mental illness and memory and storytelling. And I really wanted to use like a comics medium to portray that the best, like especially a lot of the ideas that are hard to convey like through words. So yeah.
Could you provide a timeline of this story?
A timeline of the story? Like...
Yeah. Like, how is this going to be structured?
Oh, well, I'll be honest. It's structured very weirdly. I wrote it very weirdly. I didn't write it with a plan in mind. I just started writing down the stories as I thought of them. And I think that kind of reflects the subject matter of the story because it is about memory and, like, the falseness around memory. There were stories that I remembered incorrectly that I told to other people and then they corrected me. And so there are multiple false and true stories inside of the same narrative. And because of that, the narrative I'm still organizing today. I wrote it like a bunch of stories that are interconnected, and I'm still organizing them into like a pattern that I think makes sense. Yeah, so the answer is, very weirdly...
Is there a connecting theme?
Yeah, definitely. The theme is always related to me and my grandmother, kind of how she has been like a specter over my life. She died when I was only 9, so I didn't really know her that well when she was alive, but she actually had a much bigger influence on me after she died, and I learned all these stories about her life, and I started seeing these weird similarities to my own life, especially like in the last few years.
These similarities, what are they?
Yeah, so my grandmother always struggled with mental illness, especially when she came to America. My mother's generation kind of seemingly skipped that, but I have always struggled with mental illness, and I mean, since I was quite young, I had terrible anxiety. And then as I got older, it developed more, and I kind of realized, like, I'm the generation it skipped to. And I'm happy to say that I'm much better now than I was 2 years ago.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah, but I did start developing, the one that really kind of hit the nail on the coffin was, I don't know if that's the right phrase, I started developing a form of paralysis that is triggered by stress, and I started getting paralyzed in public spaces, and I was reminded of all the times that my grandmother had stroke, and she was left alone in Pioneer Square for about 8 hours, and during those 8 hours, every second matters. It's killing brain cells, No one thought to ask or see if she was okay, except for one man who was on his way to work and passed her at the bus stop and then saw her again when he came home. And so I've had this paralysis this was now 2 years ago, on UW campus, and I immediately thought of my grandmother when it happened. We also share almost the same name. My name is Michiko. My mother's name is Michilu. Her mother's name is Michiyo, and her father's name was Michinosuke. And yeah, there's a lot of interconnected things. I would need to. My memory is so bad now, but that's part of the story.
No, thanks for sharing. That's very traumatizing.
I mean, it's it is, and it's also just life. I don't know. There's so many things that have happened, and like, I mean, they sound like the worst thing in the world, but they're just something that I lived through. So, like, yeah, they're not because I'm still here. So, yeah.
And these are points that you bring up in your thesis?
Yeah, I brought it with me too. It's obviously not. It's very visual, but I did bring it with me. And yeah, I talk a lot about how like I had this fear of like madness when I was young. Like I was so afraid that I was gonna develop certain symptoms or mental illnesses, and then I realized later that I already had them. And I just didn't realize that was happening. And I was so afraid. I realized later that I wasn't afraid of madness. I was afraid of being treated like my grandmother because what happened is, you know, I would mention things to my mother like, "Oh, it says here she said that she worked in a silkworm factory," and that wasn't an uncommon thing to do in Japan for a young woman in that time period. But my mom immediately said, "Oh, she made that up for attention."
Oh.
She totally made that up because she was probably manic, and I'm sure that didn't happen. And like another one is like, I'm reading through her old letters, and she writes consistently about this secret child she had at 14, which, you know, is a pretty big deal if it happened, because we do not know anything about this possible relative or whether or not this was someone who survived. But my mom also dismissed that as she probably made that up. And so I've always kind of been, it's not really the madness I think I was afraid of. It was the not being listened to ever, not being heard, because it was too outlandish. Like, how could that have happened? But I've seen so many things now. It's like, it can happen. I mean, yeah, I don't know. There is weird things that happen, and a lot of my story is about, I don't know if a lot of the things that she wrote about were real or not, but it doesn't really matter to me, because what matters to me is that she told those stories, and so they were significant to her in some way. Yeah.
How do you use a comic medium to process all these emotions?
So I draw a lot of like visual representations of my paralysis, of what it feels like to have like extreme emotions when I was younger. I kind of move back and forth between having structured panels to tell something that is very structured, like here's my story, or here's like I'm explaining how stroke works or how my paralysis works. And then I almost immediately get tired of the panels and like break out of them. Sure. And I a lot of the scenes that are more emotional are depicted with like free form drawings where the panels are kind of made out of the words involved, the narration or dialogue. But yeah, a lot of it is trying to represent what the paralysis feels like, the feelings of like otherworldliness of my grandmother when I was young. She was always kind of this like specter in my life that was very much unlike my other paternal grandmother. Someone else and something else entirely. Yeah.
Can I take a look at these comics?
Yes. I'll warn you, they're not in order.
Oh, that's okay.
But that one's broke. I bought this for $2 at Daiso, so. But so this first drawing is one of the only ones that needs explanation. It is an illustration of my grandmother's writing, which is almost incomprehensible most of the time because of a combination of factors. One, her handwriting is terrible. Two, she English was a second language for her, and was very difficult for her. And so her grammar and spelling and everything is a little weird. But most of all, she was basically writing word salad most of the time, meaning the words are out of order, they don't make any sense. She switches topics in the middle of a sentence, and it's really hard to figure out. So this page is essentially, I found this writing where she says, she often says, I was thinking 1948, or I was thinking 1952. She names these dates. And then she tells these stories, but they're not quite full stories. She says, Kobe City, people entertain U.S. Navy. 3 feet tall Japan, money on all over the ground and road. We have to pick up without our choice. Like, and I'm adding in my own grammar to make it make sense slightly more there.
Yeah.
But, I do know she was in Kobe City in 1948, but just this idea of making people pick money up off of the ground, I illustrated it as kind of these horrific caricatures of U.S. soldiers. And I know a big thing in when I've studied a little bit of Japanese history of the war was the Japanese were smaller physically than Americans, and that was very significant around the time of the surrender. Was that the emperor was physically smaller, and they have this picture of him. And so it's interesting that she uses the phrase 3 feet tall Japan, and there was a lot of humiliation there, I know. And my grandmother would end up marrying one of those U.S. servicemen, and depending on her mood, sometimes regretting it the rest of her life.
Depending on her mood.
Yeah, well, when she was manic, she would write these long letters about how she wished she'd never gotten married to him, and it was the biggest mistake in her life, and she was going to go back to Japan. But my mother always asserts that she loved her husband, and they were certainly an odd pair. He had cerebral palsy, but I think they always had a difficult relationship because there is necessarily so much there's so much power struggles in a relationship like that when people come to your country having just defeated you in war, and then you marry one of them, especially the fact that he was a man and she was a young woman. So, yeah. And
can you describe this art style you've inhabited for this piece?
Yeah, this one I was really thinking of, honestly, I thought of Guernica the most. I don't know if you know Picasso's Guernica. It's like an illustration of the Spanish Civil War. Where they have, I'm not a huge Picasso fan, I'll be honest.
Okay.
But I do like that one painting. It's an illustration of the bombings, where the bomb is represented by this light bulb. And there's all sorts of like animals and humans that are all tangled up together, and there's like dead bodies on the ground that are like all super angular and tangled. It's hard to tell like what's part of what. So I've drawn these two U.S. Navy servicemen who are kind of towering. Oh, there's a few of them. It's hard to tell how many that are kind of towering over the scene. And in the mainly lower left corner, there's these very small, thin, kind of grotesque figures that are all not really shaped very humanly. No one is really shaped super like a human. And there's like an old man that's super emaciated and someone curled up on the ground. And all these figures that you can't see the faces of that are picking up money off of the ground. Yeah, I just wanted to have like the Americans I wanted to have them dominating the scene, and almost these caricatures of like whiteness, where they have like these really big eyes with like tiny pupils for blue eyes.
Yeah.
And like everyone looks kind of horrifying in this. I hope I achieved that to a certain extent, where they all have too many teeth and stuff. But yeah,
it is a bit grotesque.
Yeah, and this page is not the same art style as like a lot of the other stuff that I did. I wanted to make it differently, and it was kind of an experimental one. I was experimenting as I was writing this whole thing. Like, I was just making up stuff as I went along. As far as like, what am I going to do for this page? I don't know. This sounds interesting today, as this letter I found. I want to write about that. So that's what I did for that page. And most of the pages are kind of in a different, much more simpler style, and I only have some of them inked, and they're...
You're good.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this was the very first page that I wrote, which is called One Nightmare, which is the one nightmare I remember from my childhood, which was in my grandmother's house. And it was around the time that she had a stroke. And I have a drawing about the stroke too, which is interesting.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm flipping through a lot of interesting things right now.
No, I'm fascinated.
But I talk about how the stroke was weird for me because, I mean, as a child, I don't know. Strokes are pretty terrifying. I mean, any sort of neurological condition is, unfortunately, it's really scary to watch someone, you know, especially as a child, you're taught that people behave a certain way, and that's normal, and then people don't, and it's highly stigmatized. It's associated with, like, horror, like horror movies often depict things similar to that. But when my grandmother had her stroke, as many people who have strokes do, her face was paralyzed. So it literally looked to me like it was melting off of her skull. And she was very old, so her skin was like wrinkled, and she had to be spoon fed, and it was really hard for me to see as a young child, but at the same time I feel really ashamed now that I viewed her with such terror, because like I've now been that person who needed to be spoon fed and whose face was paralyzed. And I wish I could find the page. Of course, they're not organized.
It's okay.
But it's a page where I kind of juxtapose like the image of her sitting there with a bib on, and my mother feeding her. And oh, I think I'm getting close. Yes, here it is. And then the picture of me being spoon fed by someone when I was about 20, and it says, I'm ashamed now to say it, but I was horrified. It looked as if her face was melting off. Food fell out of her mouth. But I would get my just reward in time, some poetic justice, when the same was true for me. I mean, she had this shaved head. And eventually the way she died is, I forget the medical term for it, but food got into her lungs. I mean, she was already not, as many people who are like reaching the end of their life, it can often be almost anything, but that's what it was in the end, because eating and swallowing was so hard for her. And she was often drooling and coughing up food. And it was very odd for me as a child to kind of, I read, like, she felt like a puppet being toted around to family gatherings because she was unable to really communicate at that point. And it's funny to me now because there's been so many places where I was unable to communicate, and I was still part of the like community, part of the interaction. Even if I couldn't speak, even if it looked like I was unconscious, I was actually very much there, and appreciating being included. And yeah, I think often of that term locked-in syndrome, which is what I was most afraid, which is the idea that, well, it's not a specific syndrome, but it's essentially when someone is completely unable to communicate to the outside world that they are conscious, but they remain conscious. And there are many cases of people who have been, quote unquote, locked in for decades or more without people knowing that they were basically mentally unaffected and fully conscious of the situation. They were just unable to communicate in any way that they were. And I was very afraid the first time I got paralyzed that is what would happen to me, because often those people are abused. Similarly, unfortunately, to a lot of people who are like in some state of like, yeah, can't communicate. Disability is, yeah. I'm not very good at explaining, but yeah.
No, thanks for sharing. That's very heavy topics right there.
Yeah, I mean, the graphic novel, I feel like it is pretty heavy. It's funny because I try and be like a very lighthearted person, and it's kind of out of character for me to like write something that's so long and so that is heavy. It is very heavy, and it's funny too. Like I've had to use humor a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, some of it is funny, like that I was so afraid of this happening, and then it just happens to me, and that's normal. Or like there was like one time that like we used to have in my house in 2020. I was in a household of 6, and it was very hard. Mm-hmm. We never left the house, and we used to have Shabbat every Friday because 2 of our roommates were Jewish, and like halfway through, there were a lot of people in that house, not just me, with health problems. My then partner also had a significant number of health problems. And it's not uncommon for someone to just get paralyzed or have a seizure while at the dinner table. And we would just have to carry on as normal because it was so normalized. I mean, we went, like, when we went to the 2020 protests, I was basically using my partner's wheelchair as a crutch. And yeah, it was hard, but I don't know.
Do you think all these things you experience have affected your personal relationships over the years?
Over the years, like in what way? 'Cause
there's a moment that happened with you that occurred in your life, mm-hmm. That was a factor of these mental episodes. Is that okay to say?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, they vary so much. That's
okay.
The thing is, I mean, I just think that one thing led into another. I mean, the way that I developed relationships when I was in elementary school was based on, what I learned from my parents. And then, the dysfunction that came from my relationships when I was a child. I learned lessons from that and developed new problems from that. As it carried on, I had a very significant ghosting when I was in high school of a very close friend of mine, and that certainly affected, how I interacted with people for a very long time, in that I was very afraid of them leaving me, and not just leaving me, but leaving me without warning, without any sort of like, hey, I don't think that, this should happen anymore, or like boundary setting. It was just like gone. And I had no idea what it was that I did wrong. And yeah, and in turn, I still like learn from my relationships now, but I haven't ever I've had very few experiences of where people were just like, I'm checking out because you're too much. I think because I'm a very open person about who I am, the things I struggle with. I'm pretty open about it. I don't think that I get as close to people who might have not wanted that in the first place. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It sounds like you're very reflective on heartbreak.
I mean, I always have been, I think. It was hard in high school, but I don't know who doesn't have a difficult high school. Although I would say high school was worse than middle school for me. I don't know. Everyone talks about middle school, and I get it, but high school was way harder. yeah, high school was really difficult, and that kind of set me up um, for a rough college years. But
Really?
yeah,
Oh.
yeah.
One thing I've noticed
Mhm.
is your Japanese identity has been coming up a lot in
Yes.
these comics.
Oh, it definitely does.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my grandmother was from Awajishima, Japan, which is a island in the inland sea near Kobe.
Hmm.
And that makes me a quarter Japanese. The rest of my family is white. Um, Most people think that I am half Japanese, and there's always been a lot of weird tensions around the fact that I am a quarter. Um, I Yeah, because it varies so much. I'm very much the white person in certain Asian American communities, and I'm very much not the white person when I go visit my father's family in Michigan. I've been asked multiple times if I was the foreign exchange student there, even after being introduced. Where my dad went to elementary school with the people who were asking.
It's a lot.
Yeah, and my grandfather still thinks that I was named after the state of Michigan, and so he pronounces my name Michiko, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Michigan is hard. It's hard to be. I visited there a couple times, and I write briefly in this, even though it's a little tangential. About while I was writing this, my other grandmother passed away. It was not a huge surprise. She had been really struggling for a while, but because of that, I went to my my dad's hometown, and it's always interesting to be there now, because I've always been an outsider as mixed race, as Asian, but now I'm extra sticking out because I'm also trans and sometimes visibly disabled. It depends on the day. But I remember very keenly last summer, I walked through a room and someone said behind me, "What happened to her?" And I thought, oh my, what? Why would you say that? Why would you not just ask me? But sorry, I'm getting off on a tangent. Yeah, the Japanese heritage part is really interesting because I've always felt really connected to it. And I spent some of my undergraduate career studying Japanese classes where I could here and there. I didn't get a whole lot of time because I didn't major in Asian studies or Japan studies or Japanese as a language. And I also talk about this here that it was a huge shame on me when I couldn't learn Japanese. And let me see if I can get that page. They're all just in the wrong order.
You're doing great.
Thank you. So yeah, I talk about in October 2020, my great aunt passed away. My grandmother's sister. So originally I had really hoped, this is a project that's been going on for a long time. My mom tried to write it. I've tried to write it. My grandmother tried to write it. And I really wanted to include my great aunt in it. And then in 2020, she refused to eat. She had been alone for 6 months in a nursing facility, and she just didn't want to do it anymore. And I was really ashamed because I had never learned Japanese enough to be able to speak with her. She never really knew very much English, and mostly when she saw me, she would just say my name over and over again. She loved her grandkids and extended family, and she loved that she had family in America and Japan. But when I came to UW, my goal in college was to get really good at Japanese, so I could read old Japanese literary texts, and that's what I wanted to do. It was a little ambitious. And so my freshman year, I was at a different college, and I took 200 level Japanese, and I did quite well in it. But then the following year when I transferred to UW, I did terribly in 300 level. It was really grammar heavy. I was really not good at that. And I was really ashamed because I stopped taking Japanese and I didn't tell my Japanese relatives. So when my great aunt died, that was one of the hardest parts, was just the shame over not learning the language. And part of that shame was that there were other students in the class who had no Japanese heritage who did way better than me. And I found out later that this is not an uncommon experience for like people from like diasporas who are learning the language of their ancestors. But I was just so afraid of making a mistake that I just never took any risks because I didn't want to be. There was so much. I feel like there was more eyes on me because everyone knew I had Japanese heritage with my name. Japanese is really hard.
I'm sure it is.
It's like one of the hardest languages to learn from English. I learned French, and it's weird to me that I could still kind of read books in French, and I only took it for 4 years. I guess that is kind of a bit, but like my cousin studied Japanese kindergarten through 12th grade, and I still never heard her speak it. But in my great aunt's like obituary or the speech at the funeral, it was all about how she was so happy that people were connecting the family again, and I just felt so horrible that I had failed. I'd quit taking Japanese, and I still hope to learn it. I don't think I want to learn it in a university setting anymore, because I really want it for practical purposes of speaking with my family. And there are some people in my family who speak both English and Japanese, but translation is a complex thing. And oftentimes we would have the experience of my aunt saying a really long thing and then her daughter saying, she says she wants to do that. So I'd go, I don't know if that's what she said, but also you're already doing a bunch of labor for our family translating, so yeah.
Thanks for the extensive history.
Yeah, sorry. I talk a lot. Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. You're a great guest for this
Thank you.
podcast.
I talk a lot, and I talk a lot disorganized.
What? I think that was pretty organized.
Oh, I don't know.
So I am curious if your own transgender identity has affected your project at all.
Yeah, I've tried to figure out how much I want to include in this about it. Because I feel like if I get started, I could just go on a tangent about my entire gender history since birth that is not really that related to my grandmother, and then I'd have to ink it all. And that would be kind of a pain. But I do mention when my great aunt dies that we had this horrible Zoom call. I don't know where the page is. We had this horrible Zoom call with her for the last time, and I hadn't seen her in 2 years since it was in person. I saw her in 2018 when I just graduated high school. But we had terrible Zoom call vibes. 4 a.m. Because it was the only time we could do it that synced up with when they were free. We woke up in the middle of the night, 4 a.m. I was at my parents' house. I didn't really want to be there. And we basically just said, okay, bye. We couldn't really say anything because we didn't know how to speak Japanese. So it was the most uncomfortable. There's something so deeply sad and disconnected, as is true of any Zoom something like that. And then, of course, her funeral was also on Zoom. But in the call, I briefly wondered if she recognized that my voice had changed or if she even cared. And it was really, and I mentioned that briefly in here on whatever page it's on. It was a really kind of weird moment where I was like, does she even notice now? I don't know. Maybe she doesn't even care. It was hard to tell how aware she was at the time. She seemed like she had given up, and it was really sad. But I mean, I do talk about it a bit because I'm part of this matriline. My grandmother, this grandmother I talk about is my maternal grandmother, and there's always been a large number of women in my Japanese family. When I went there, the only man in the family basically left. In all the pictures is my father, who's like 2 feet taller than everyone else and just looks like a total white guy, gaijin in all the pictures. And everybody else is like a short-haired Japanese woman. And it's definitely interesting. I briefly came out to my Japanese relatives last fall. I sent them an email that I was working on this project, and I was like, my voice has been dropped for like 2 years now. I should probably mention it. I've really procrastinated with some people, like my Michigander family. Like, I don't have the time to explain to them.
It's a lot of energy.
Yeah, well, I was like, you know what? I don't owe you this explanation, because what you're going to do is you're going to ask me questions that are not helpful to me or anyone really. And so I was like, yeah, I just, you know what? If you figured out, you figured out.
Same.
But yeah, like, it's like, do whatever. Like, I don't have the time to put in my labor to explain something to you when you're not going to give me anything back. My parents haven't quite understood that. They're like, but won't they respect you more if they... No. But, so I came out to my family in Japan in an email, because setting up any sort of call with them is very difficult. And I just kind of briefly said, also, I'm not a woman. Etc., etc. And like, I use they them pronouns, but that was like, also, it's Japanese, and Japanese has a totally different system of how things are gendered. And I said, but I'm keeping my name. My name is still Michiko, which is I write about that in here too. But and my relatives, I'm not sure if they fully understood, but she responded with the most love and you know, kindness in her heart. She said, "Oh, we care about you so much. We're so glad that you're graduating." And I was really glad to hear that. A lot of the culture in Japan is less around homophobia and queerphobia and transphobia is less like, you are a sinner and we hate you, and more of that's not something we talk about. That's not something we talk about. To legally change your gender in Japan, though, you do have to be legally sterilized.
Oh, wow.
Yes, you have to be legally sterilized, and you can have no children under 20 in order to change your legal gender. It is really strict. It is very binary, and a little ominous and creepy that you have to be sterilized, frankly, especially when I talked about this in my classes. Japan is going through such a crisis of aging population right now, and they're always talking about low birth rates as a political thing. But I also talked about my name because I thought about changing my name when I was first kind of transitioning, like, I don't even know, like a year and a half, 2.5 years ago. Honestly, I've lost track because the pandemic, time is weird. Before the plague, I thought about changing my name, but I knew I wanted to keep at least the first character the same as the rest of my family, which is Michi, which means like path, sort of, like the way. Like the same as in Taoism is the same character, and like Aikido, and it means like the way of good teaching. But the last part of my name, the weird part about it just means child, so child of the way. But it's feminine, kind of weirdly, because otherwise ko is generally kind of masculine to neutral. Okay. But when it's in a name, it's feminine. So for a while, I thought about changing it to Michito, which is almost exactly the same, but it is the character for like person. And that was around my 20th birthday, which is traditionally the like age of adulthood in Japan.
Okay.
I ended up not changing it. And now it's kind of become transgressive again because now sometimes I'm being clocked as more masculinely by people. It really depends on the person. And it's going to be very interesting when I eventually go back to Japan and just experience life while having that name. It's a very common woman's name in Japan. It's the name of the empress. I mean, she's like ancient now. I don't know. She's in her 90s. But it's also just like the name of like a generic woman's name in everything. Like there's a character in Totoro that has that name, and people always point it out when I watch it with people. But yeah, I think that's, yeah, I talked a lot.
No, I mean, I'm curious because I'm trans.
Yeah.
But like in the other way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, my trans identity has been really kind of funky because like I was designated female at birth, but I don't really consider myself like trans masc either. I'm kind of getting clocked like all over the place now, which is fun. Except like weirdly, and it's so funny to me, like my hair is getting longer and people are she-herring me again now. I'm like, I don't know what pattern you're working off of, but okay, like I don't know what's going on. But it is a whole process, and luckily it's something that like I'm a very at peace with at my time in my life. Like I'm very proud of being trans, and like I'm very happy to be trans. I love trans people. You know, it's been a long process, but luckily I feel a lot less like shame about that than I may have had in the past. But it is interesting now as like a cultural thing because there's like a different culture of queerness in Japan, totally different. And there's not the idea of non-binary, but there's a gender called X-gender. With X-gender, which is kind of it's the same but different, and it's really hard to find materials on that in English, which is part of the reason why I wanted to learn Japanese. But yeah, I'm really interested in like interacting with the queer and trans community in Japan, but I also recognize that it's different culturally, and I can't like expect that the culture would be the same as queer and trans culture in America, because there's a totally different history of queerness and gender in Japan than there is in America and the West in general.
That's very true.
Yeah.
So you said that you wish to go back to Japan at some point.
Yeah.
Were you born and raised there?
No, I was not. I did visit there very frequently when I was younger. I was born here in Seattle, and I visited there a few times when I was young, enough to where the sounds come very naturally to me, but like not the language. I think I got the like phonology part while I was there because my relatives would speak Japanese to me, and I wish my parents had done a little bit more pushing on that to like try and get me to go to an immersion school or something.
Okay.
But I didn't grow up there, but it is a place that feels very much like home to me. The sounds, the smells, like everything sensory about that, and the landscape, the land is very familiar to me. There's these beautiful mountainous forests, and I've spent several trips there. The last one was in 2018 where I worked on a farm in rural Nagano, which is not where my family is from, and Japan is super regional. Like the regions are really different, totally different kind of cultures. But I hope to go there again. Right now it is completely closed. Like you have to be, I think you either have to work in like education, medicine, or government to get in right now. There, or like have like a spouse that lives there in order to get into the country. because originally for this project, my plan was to go to Japan and write it while I was in Japan. And preferably near Awajishima or in Kobe, which is where my family lives now. But obviously, pandemic happened. Definitely can't be doing that. And I don't know the next time that I might be able to go, but I would love to go there for, I mean, so many reasons. I also, like, with a major in anthropology, the island that my grandmother is from is very culturally and archaeologically rich. There's a lot of, sounds very boring, but bronze bells there that are very significant. Along with, there's this puppetry tradition called Awaji Ningyo there, where it's ritual puppetry, which is kind of interesting. But yeah.
And you're thinking about moving to California.
Yes. And part of that is I hope to connect with a larger Japanese American community. There's also a long history of Japanese American like farmers there in Northern California. Yeah, I am hoping to move to the Bay Area. Just there's so much history there of like BIPOC activism, and also like as an artist, there's a lot of cutie BIPOC artists there that I know about, and like organizations related to that. Yeah. So that's why I'm interested.
Yeah, it sounds like Berkeley or Oakland is a good choice for you.
Yeah, that's probably where I'm going to be. I can't afford to live in San Francisco. But yeah, so I'll probably be living in one or the other and then working in one or the other of those places, possibly San Francisco. But I don't really want to commute that far.
Yeah, it's got to take an hour.
Yeah, that's what I look... Me checking Google Maps, like it's yeah, because I'm like, that doesn't look that far away, right? There's just some water in between. I'm like, oh, that's an hour. Oh, never mind. But yeah, I don't know. I might, because there is a comic distributor similar to the one that I work at that is in San Francisco called Silver Sprocket. So I might have to. Not sure.
What are your animation inspirations?
Animation?
Or comic inspirations?
Or comics? Oh my gosh. So the ones I worked from for this graphic novel, like I was keeping in mind, were a lot of other... There's actually for some reason, a great number of graphic novels that are about very similar topics, like transgenerational trauma, like history, kind of like memoir. It's about mental illness. I mean, obviously Mouse was the first one that came to mind, by Art Spiegelman. And I certainly kept that in mind. My style is completely different from that. And I don't think I would be able to do something like Spiegelman did, which is it's like very dense and like super, it's pretty long too. I mean, it was written over a long period of time. But visually, I took a lot from... my favorite thing is Monsters, which has much more of like the panelless style. And I also thought of David B's Epileptic, which is a really unusual one that uses this like really bold black and white style and represents epilepsy with these kind of like otherworldly creatures that are really graphically interesting, and like the doctors as otherworldly creatures. So those are the three that I like definitely like I talked about in my original thesis proposal, and I was definitely thinking about when I was writing it. But I mean, obviously I've unconsciously taken tons of different inspiration over the years. I mean, I try and read as many graphic novels as I can find, and comics, but I'm very much associated more with like the underground weird zine scene than like traditional like Marvel and DC superhero comics.
Good.
That's definitely like more of what I've always been interested in. No shame to Marvel and DC, etc., etc. But like weird stuff. And then I mean, there's tons of books that have come out recently about mental health and mental illness, like well, and this is not even recent, but like what's it called? Marbles by Ellen Forney.
Mm.
And then she did a couple graphic novels after that. There's another one that came out more recently that I also read. But yeah, I've really focused on. I also like did it all in paper. I've never been super great at digital art. Like originally I wanted to be, because like all the cool kids my age were doing digital art, and then I just never really got into it. So I've also drawn from artists that do more traditional art on paper, which means that it's always going to be a little scruffy. But and that includes, like, my favorite thing is Monsters. It's all done in ballpoint pen, and it's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if, are you familiar with it? It's like there's like beautifully shaded portraits done completely in ballpoint pen, like with an amount of realism that I am not skilled at.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I
believe it.
Yeah.
It sounds like a time-consuming task.
Yeah, that one was written over like a really long time. Yeah, Emil Ferris. And the author had, I believe, was like paralyzed from West Nile virus. So another disability, like another disabled author that I'm drawing from. Interestingly, like, yeah.
Well, those are all the questions I had. Is there anything you want to talk about?
I'm not sure. I mean, gosh, I'm just looking through here now.
That's okay.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, yeah. The archive. I don't know if I talked enough about the archive that I'm going to include. I have all the writings from my grandmother, and also the medical records from when she was, I'm just scratching the surface here. But I have the medical records from when she was, a patient at Western State Hospital, which still exists as a psychiatric institution. And in fact, someone once suggested that I go to. And I said, no, I would rather not repeat history, because it was the only one covered by my insurance, creepily enough. Yeah, I'm going to be kind of juxtaposing what I have written with writing that my grandmother did, writing that my mother did. My mom tried to write a memoir around in 2002 when her mom broke her hip, and they found her in Japan, and it was a whole thing. And she didn't get very far, though, because she was told that she was a bad writer in elementary school. So those comments really stick with people. But yeah, I'm hoping to juxtapose with that kind of archive, and also photographs. There's photographs going pretty far back to my great-great-grandparents, Gisaburo Hirano, my great-great-grandfather. Yeah, there's a lot of, like, I really love, one of my favorite things is, like, looking through old ephemera. I don't know, maybe it's just, like, a Snoopy, like, instinct, or, like, not Snoopy, sneaky, like, I just want to, like, snoop in people's business, like, I don't know, but I'm kind of indulging that with, like, providing these materials, and of the people who have written them that are still alive. I've been talking to them about what they're okay with including, but I kind of, for a while, I was like, what are the ethics of this with my grandmother? Would my grandmother want to have wanted this? And eventually I kind of came that, like, she was always trying to be heard, and, like, no one would listen to her. I feel like they would just write her off as making stuff up, or that it wasn't important, or, like, whatever it was. And so I really wanted to, part of it was give her a platform for her words to be heard, even if they might make no sense to some people. Like, I think that there's a lot of truth in them, like, even if they might sound nonsensical. Yeah, I don't know. But I wanted to include them. I wanted to make sure that I include them because, yeah, like I really believe that there's truth in them, even though they're so hard to read. And I think I'm gonna, like maybe type some of them out next to the original writing so that it's a little more readable. But I also like people seeing the original because it's like almost like art in itself. The writing is so weird. Yeah.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
You're a fascinating person.
Thank you. I really enjoy talking about this project, obviously, because I wrote over 70 pages of it or something.
Yeah, I'm looking at the stack. I wish I had your motivation.
I mean, it was hard. The only thing motivating me was I was like, I have 1/4 left and I need to write a graphic thesis right now. So I did a page a day, which was very fast.
Disciplined.
Yeah, I don't know how I did it. I'm usually not that disciplined, like, in all honesty. And the only thing that got me through it was by doing it in, like, a random order. Just by, I want to write about this thing today because I remembered this. And then some of them are in, like, real time, like their responses to things that happened while I was writing it. Like, oh, I found out the story wasn't true. Or, like, I was talking to my friend about this and he told me this story that I told him that I don't remember anymore. That happens a lot. Yeah.
Well, I can't wait to see this finished product of literary anthropology.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess it is kind of, it is a bit of an anthropological project. It is interesting. It's not in a strict sense, but yeah.
Would you like to plug anything in before we go?
I have an Instagram. And it's wild.michiko. That's WILD.MICHIKO. And I'm in the process of making a website because I also sell my art. I do, like, this is kind of my side project now compared to, like, I do a lot of other types of art, and I'm constantly buying new art supplies to try new art. That's the main one right now, but I also work at Push Pull, and I sell my art there. And there's going to be I believe, like, a gallery show there in about a week, where I have a painting in. So that's something.
That's really cool. What do you mean that's something?
It's my first show, I think. I mean, I've made lots of paintings before, but it's my first, like, that's a real show where, like, theoretically I could sell the art. We all just did, like, we had, like, these fun shaped panels, and everyone has, like, a themed, like, a color scheme theme. But people are doing all sorts of stuff. Like, one person I know, like, made it 3D. One person is, like, cross-stitching it. So it's a very multimedia, interdisciplinary show, which I like because that's kind of the stuff I do. Yeah.
Well, go support Michiko on their future website.
Thank you. Yeah.
So it was great having you on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Well, hope you have a good day.
Thank you. You too.